They told the judge I was unstable, that I fabricated stories, that I'd always been emotionally volatile. My mother even dabbed her eyes when she said it. I was sitting 3 chairs away from them in a quiet courtroom, listening to my own parents describe me like I was a danger to myself and to them. And then the clerk pressed play. If you've ever had someone rewrite your entire personality in public, you know the kind of silence that comes right before the truth walks in. Before I tell you what was on that recording, if you've ever felt misunderstood by the very people who were supposed to protect you, stay with me. And if this story connects with you in any way, like, comment, subscribe, but only if it feels real to you. I'd also love to know where you're watching from. Sometimes it helps to remember we're not alone. My name is Leora Kane. I'm 31 now, but this really started when I was 19. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood outside Madison, clean sidewalks, trimmed hedges, the kind of place where everyone waves but nobody asks real questions. My father was a financial advisor, calm, controlled, respected. My mother volunteered at church and coordinated community events. She knew everyone's birthdays, everyone's secrets. From the outside, we were solid. Inside, we were quiet. I learned early that emotions were inconvenient. When I was 8, I cried after losing a spelling bee. My father crouched down and said, "Composure is strength. Cry later." Later never came. By high school, I was the sensitive one. That was the label. Not rebellious, not troubled, sensitive, which in my family meant dramatic. The first time they told someone I was unstable, I was 22. I had moved back home after college to save money for grad school. I worked at a local legal aid office. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered to me. That summer, I started noticing things. Small withdrawals from my savings account I hadn't authorized, mail addressed to me already opened, conversations that stopped when I entered a room. When I asked my father about the bank account, he smiled. "You probably forgot a transfer." I hadn't. When I brought it up again, he sighed. "You've always had anxiety around money." That wasn't true either, but doubt is quiet. It creeps in. A month later, my mother told my aunt over dinner that I'd been having episodes. I was sitting right there. I remember the way my fork froze halfway to my mouth. "What episodes?" I asked. She laughed lightly. "Oh, honey, don't start." Don't start. That phrase followed me for years. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just stopped talking. That was my first mistake. Silence is easy to reinterpret. The real shift happened when I decided to move out. I had found a small apartment downtown. Nothing fancy, just independence. When I told them, my father looked disappointed. My mother looked scared. "Are you sure you're thinking clearly?" she asked. "I signed the lease," I said. That night, I overheard them in the kitchen. "She's spiraling again," my mother whispered. Spiraling? Over a lease? I moved out anyway. 2 weeks later, I got a call from my cousin. "She told everyone you're taking medication." I wasn't. "She said you had a breakdown at work." I didn't. And that's when I understood something dangerous. They weren't confused. They were building a narrative. I confronted them one Sunday afternoon. We sat at the same dining table where I'd once done algebra homework. I asked why you are telling people I'm unstable. My father didn't blink. "Because you've been erratic." Define erratic. "You're defensive, suspicious. You accuse us of things." I felt my pulse in my ears. I asked about my bank account. My mother leaned forward. "That's what we mean. You jump to conclusions." Gaslighting is subtle when it's dressed as concern. I started documenting everything, screenshots, dates, conversations, not because I thought I'd need proof, because I was starting to doubt myself. The humiliation built slowly. Family gatherings became interrogations. "Are you seeing someone about your stress? Are you sleeping enough? You look tired." It was coordinated, polite, smiling, devastating. The breaking point came when I applied for a housing grant tied to my legal aid work. My father had to co-sign a financial disclosure because of an old joint account from college. He refused, told the administrator I was mentally fragile and not capable of handling long-term contracts. That word followed me into an official email thread, mentally fragile. I sat on my apartment floor that night and cried for the first time in years. Not loudly, just quietly, because I realized they were willing to sacrifice my credibility to maintain control. That's when I filed for financial separation, closed the joint account, changed banks, requested documentation. My father responded by calling my extended family. Within a month, the story had evolved. I wasn't independent, I was unstable. I wasn't cautious, I was paranoid. And then they escalated. They petitioned for a temporary conservatorship review, said I was concerned about my judgment. Concerned. I remember sitting in that courtroom for the first time, watching them present affidavits describing my episodes. The judge looked at me with polite curiosity. I looked at my parents. They wouldn't meet my eyes. That was the day I decided silence wasn't strength. Documentation was, because I had something they didn't know about. A voicemail, saved accidentally, recorded the night they thought I wasn't home, and I kept it, not out of revenge, out of survival, because deep down, I knew someday I would need it.
The voicemail wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no threats, just my parents' voices drifting through the hallway the night they thought I'd already left for work. I had come back upstairs because I forgot my charger. My phone had been recording a voice memo for a client note earlier that morning. I didn't realize it was still running until hours later. At first, it was just background noise, cabinet doors, the hum of the dishwasher. Then my father's voice. "We need to make this official before she moves further out of our reach." My mother sighed. "If we say she's unstable, they'll take us seriously." Silence. Then, softer. "She won't fight it. She hates conflict." That's the part that settled in my bones. Not the strategy, the assumption. They believed I wouldn't defend myself. I listened to that recording at least 20 times before the first court date. Every pause, every tone. Not because I wanted to memorize it, because I needed to be certain I wasn't misinterpreting it. Gaslighting teaches you to doubt your own hearing. The conservatorship petition wasn't immediate control. It was a review, an evaluation of whether I could manage my finances independently. On paper, it looked protective. Concerned parents worried about their adult daughter's mental state. But in reality, it would have given them access to my accounts again, decision-making authority, the power to label my independence as impairment. The first hearing was procedural. Their lawyer spoke in calm, practiced sentences about recent behavioral inconsistencies. Routine, like unauthorized withdrawals. My bank inquiries, my apartment lease, my increasing hostility. Hostility. I remember gripping my folder so tightly my knuckles went white. When the judge asked if I had representation, I said yes. I didn't mention that I'd used half my savings to hire a small civil rights attorney named Renata Doyle. She was younger than my parents expected. That worked in our favor. Renata didn't argue emotionally. She asked for documentation, medical records, hospitalizations, police reports. There were none, just statements, just narrative. The judge ordered a temporary psychological evaluation, standard, objective. My parents looked relieved. I felt strangely calm, because I knew something they didn't. The evaluation came back clear. No evidence of impaired judgment, no signs of instability, independent functioning intact. The report was thorough, clinical, neutral. My parents didn't look at me when it was read into the record, but they didn't withdraw the petition either. That's when I understood something darker. It wasn't about concern, it was about reputation. If they withdrew quietly, people might question why. If they pushed and lost, they could still say they tried. And in families like mine, trying looks noble, even when it's invasive. Renata asked me one question before the final hearing. Are you ready to escalate? I knew what she meant. The voicemail. Up until then, we hadn't disclosed it. It was leverage. But once played, it would permanently fracture whatever illusion of unity remained. I went home that night and sat on my kitchen floor again. Same spot, different feeling. I thought about being 8 years old and swallowing tears after the spelling bee, about being 22 and freezing at dinner when my mother called me unstable, about every cousin who gently asked if I was getting help. I wasn't crazy. I was inconvenient, and inconvenient daughters are easier to discredit than confront. The humiliation had been slow, public, smiling, but this would be decisive. The final hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. I wore a navy blazer, minimal makeup, hair pulled back. Not because appearance proves sanity, but because perception matters. My father's lawyer reiterated concerns. Miss Kane has demonstrated persistent paranoia regarding routine financial matters. Routine, like unauthorized withdrawals. Renata stood calmly. Your Honor, we'd like to submit Exhibit D. The clerk took the flash drive. My stomach flipped. My parents exchanged a glance. My mother's hand tightened around her purse strap. This is an audio recording dated May 14th. It contains a private conversation between the petitioners regarding strategy. Strategy. The judge nodded to the clerk. And that's when everything slowed. Because once a recording is entered into evidence, it stops being family conflict. It becomes fact. The clerk pressed play. My father's voice filled the quiet courtroom. Clear. Unmistakable. We need to make this official before she moves further out of our reach. My mother. If we say she's unstable, they'll take us seriously. Silence. Then, softer. She won't fight it. She hates conflict. The recording ended without drama, just the hum of the dishwasher. Silence followed. Not explosive. Heavy. The judge removed his glasses. Counsel, he said slowly, would you like to explain this? Their lawyer didn't speak. He looked at them. They didn't answer. Because explanation requires truth, and truth was already playing in the room.
No one gasped. There was no dramatic outburst, just the quiet sound of a pen being set down on the judge's bench. That was louder than anything. My father tried first. It's being taken out of context, he said, but even his voice lacked conviction. Out of context how? The judge asked. Silence. My mother leaned toward their attorney and whispered something. He didn't respond. Because what do you argue when your own voice is the evidence? The judge asked for a recess. 15 minutes. It felt like 15 hours. I stepped into the hallway with Renata. My legs were steady. I was surprised by that. You did the right thing, she said quietly. I nodded. But right and painful are not opposites. Across the hall, my parents stood together. For once, they weren't composed. My father's posture was rigid, my mother's face pale. They looked small, and I hated that part of me noticed, because even after everything, some reflex in me still wanted to protect them from embarrassment. That's how deep conditioning goes. When we returned, the judge didn't waste time. The petition for conservatorship is denied, he said evenly. He paused. And I strongly advise against any further attempts to undermine Miss Kane's autonomy without substantiated evidence. Substantiated. That word echoed. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about proof. The case closed with a strike of the gavel that sounded ordinary, but it was the first time in years that an authority figure had listened to both sides and chosen mine. Outside the courtroom, reporters weren't waiting. There was no media storm. This wasn't that kind of family. But word travels fast in quiet communities. By the time I got home, 3 relatives had texted. "Are you okay? We didn't know it was like that. I'm sorry." I didn't respond immediately. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt exposed, because the recording proved strategy. It didn't erase years of whispered doubts. The next morning, my mother called. I let it ring. Then she texted, "We need to talk." We did, but not that day, because for once, I wasn't rushing to fix discomfort. That weekend, I went for a long walk by the lake. Cold wind, gray water. I thought about the humiliation, the subtle kind, the kind that doesn't leave bruises but changes how people look at you. At church, at barbecues, at weddings. I had watched cousins tilt their heads sympathetically, watched friends hesitate before sharing personal news, like I might overreact. They had believed the narrative because it came from my parents. Credibility flows downward in families. That's what I learned. Not because elders are always right, but because children are assumed to be reactive, even at 31. A childhood memory surfaced that afternoon. I was 11. I had drawn a portrait for an art contest. My father looked at it and said, "Interesting interpretation." I asked what that meant. He said, "You see things differently." It wasn't criticism, but it planted something. Different. Different became sensitive. Sensitive became unstable. The progression was slow, almost invisible, until it wasn't. 3 days after the hearing, my father showed up at my apartment. Alone. No lawyer, no mother. He stood in the hallway like he wasn't sure he belonged there. "I never meant it for it to go that far," he said. That sentence, it always comes after consequences. "How far did you mean it for it to go?" I asked calmly. He exhaled. "We were worried." "No," I said quietly. "You were losing control." His jaw tightened. "That's unfair." "Is it?" Silence stretched. He looked older, not fragile, just confronted. "We thought you were making impulsive decisions. Like moving out? Like cutting financial ties." That's when it clicked. My independence wasn't instability, it was unpredictability, and unpredictability scared them. "I'm not your extension," I said softly. He didn't argue, but he didn't apologize either, because apologies require admitting motive, and motive was control. He left without resolution, which strangely felt like progress. For the first time, the silence between us wasn't loaded with accusation. It was loaded with awareness. But the story wasn't over, because 2 weeks later, something else surfaced. Something I hadn't expected. A letter from the State Licensing Board for Financial Advisors, addressed to my father and copied to me. The subject line made my stomach drop. Formal inquiry regarding conduct. Because court recordings don't disappear. They become public record. And public record has consequences beyond family.
The letter wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accusatory in tone. It was procedural. An inquiry has been initiated regarding statements made under oath and potential misuse of legal mechanisms. That's how it read. Clinical, detached. But I knew what it meant. My father's profession was built on credibility, judgment, fiduciary responsibility, and now there was a record suggesting he had attempted to manipulate legal processes for personal control. I didn't contact the board. I didn't file a complaint. The recording had simply been entered into evidence. Public record. Consequences ripple. That's what people forget when they tried to control narratives. 2 days after the letter arrived, my mother came to see me. Not at home, at a cafe near my office. Neutral ground. She looked tired. Not theatrical, just worn.
"They're reviewing his license," she said quietly. I stirred my coffee. "I know. They think he abused his professional authority." I met her eyes. "Did he?" Her mouth tightened. "That recording doesn't show everything." "No," I agreed. "It shows enough." Silence settled between us. Not hostile, heavy. "You humiliated us," she said finally. There it was. Not "you were hurt," not "we're sorry." Humiliation. "I was humiliated for years," I replied evenly. She flinched slightly. "That's different." "Why?" She didn't answer. Because in her mind, family humiliation was private. Mine had been social, subtle, smiling. The licensing board requested a formal statement from me, just to clarify the context of the recording. Renata reviewed it before I submitted anything. "You don't have to escalate," she reminded me. "I'm not escalating," I said. "I'm answering questions." And that was true. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I described what happened factually: dates, petitions, statements. I didn't speculate about motives. The recording did that on its own. Weeks passed. Tension built quietly. At church, my parents stopped attending their usual Sunday service. Whispers shifted direction. People who once looked at me with concern now looked at them with curiosity. And here's the complicated part. I didn't enjoy it, because I know what it feels like to have your character questioned without context. But accountability isn't cruelty, it's clarity. One afternoon, my father called, not to argue, not to defend, to ask a question. "If I lose my license, will that be enough?" I closed my eyes briefly. "Enough for what?" "For you." The weight of that question surprised me. "I didn't want you to lose anything," I said carefully. "I wanted you to stop calling me unstable." Silence. "You think we lied?" "I think you were afraid of losing control." He exhaled slowly. "Maybe I was." That was the closest thing to truth I'd heard from him. Not an apology, but a crack in the armor. The board concluded their review 2 months later. He wasn't stripped of his license, but he was formally reprimanded, required to complete ethics counseling, and placed under monitoring, publicly documented. Not career-ending, but not invisible either. When the decision letter arrived, my mother called again. "He's devastated." I listened, because devastation isn't something I celebrate. He built his reputation for 30 years, and I built mine quietly for 10. Another silence, this one softer. "I didn't realize how much damage we caused," she said. That sentence almost undid me. Almost. Because realization after exposure is different than realization before it. But it was something. A shift. A small one. That night, I had my first real breakdown. Not in public, not in court, in my living room. I sat on the floor and cried. Not because I felt vindicated, because I felt exhausted. 12 years of subtle gaslighting, months of legal strategy, family fractures, reputation recovery. It takes something out of you, even when you're right. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. I was 6, sitting at the kitchen table coloring. My mother leaned over and corrected the sky I'd drawn purple. "Skies are blue, Leora." I remember looking at the crayon. Purple felt honest that day, but I changed it, because being corrected felt safer than being different. That's what this was about. They needed the sky to stay blue. I needed permission to draw it purple. And when I refused to recolor myself, they called it instability. The board's decision didn't repair everything, but it shifted the power dynamic.
not dramatically, just enough. Because for the first time, my parents weren't the unquestioned authorities in every room, and that changed how they spoke, how they listened, how they hesitated before labeling. But the real confrontation hadn't happened yet, because there was still one thing neither of them had said, and I wasn't going to let this close without it.
The last conversation didn't happen in a courtroom. It didn't happen at a cafe. It happened at their house, the same living room where I'd once been corrected about purple skies. I hadn't been back since the hearing. When I walked in, everything looked the same. Same beige couch, same framed family photos, except now I saw them differently. I wasn't the child in the frame anymore. I was the woman who had stood up in court. My father sat in his usual chair, my mother on the sofa. There was no lawyer, no paperwork, just us. "I don't want another strategy conversation," I said calmly before either of them could start. "I want honesty." They exchanged a glance. My father cleared his throat. "We thought you were becoming unpredictable," he said. "That's not honesty," I replied softly. "That's justification." Silence. Real silence. The kind that makes people uncomfortable. My mother looked at her hands. "We were scared," she said. "Of what?" "That you'd cut us out completely." There it was. Fear. Not concern. Fear. "You tried to legally control me to prevent me from leaving," I said evenly. "We thought it would keep you close. Control as connection." I let that sit between us. "You told everyone I was unstable," I continued. "Do you know what that does to a person?" My father looked at me this time, not past me, not through me, at me. "It isolates them," I answered my own question. "It makes every reaction suspicious, every boundary look like evidence." My mother's eyes filled. "We didn't mean to isolate you." "But you did." That's the thing about harm. Intent doesn't erase impact. My father leaned back, his composure thinner than I'd ever seen it. "We didn't know how to handle your independence," he admitted. That was closer. "You raised me to think critically," I said. "Then you punished me for using it." He swallowed. "You always questioned things." "I still do." Another long pause. And then, finally, "I'm sorry." It wasn't dramatic. No tears in his voice, no grand speech. Just 2 words. But they were specific. "I'm sorry for calling you unstable." My mother nodded quickly. "I'm sorry for repeating it." There it was. Not if you felt hurt, not if we misunderstood. Clear, direct, late, but real. I didn't rush to forgive. Forgiveness isn't a reflex. "I need something else," I said quietly. They waited. "If you ever disagree with me again, talk to me, not about me." My father nodded. "That's fair." "And if you're scared I'll leave," I added, "don't try to trap me. Ask me." My mother's shoulders shook slightly. "We didn't know how." "I know," I said, and I meant that, because fear can make smart people reckless, but fear doesn't excuse strategy. We didn't hug immediately. We sat there, 3 adults, untangling years of narrative, and for the first time I didn't feel like the sensitive one, or the unstable one, or the different one. I felt equal, not because they surrendered authority, because they acknowledged my autonomy. In the months that followed, things didn't magically transform. There were awkward dinners, stiff conversations, but something fundamental had shifted. They no longer introduced me as our sensitive daughter. They introduced me as Leora, simple, clean, no qualifiers. The licensing board monitoring ended quietly. My father completed his ethics counseling. He never brought it up again, but he listened more, paused more, And when extended family hinted at the old narrative, my mother corrected it. She was never unstable, she'd say gently. We misunderstood. Hearing that the first time felt surreal, not triumphant, just steady, a small restoration. The real closure didn't come from the court or the board. It came one Sunday afternoon when my cousin asked casually, "So what really happened back then?" And I answered, without shaking, without defending, without over-explaining. I stood up for myself. That was it, because the truth didn't need embellishment anymore. I think about that voicemail sometimes, the dishwasher humming in the background, the casual way they assumed I wouldn't fight. That assumption shaped everything, not because they were villains, but because they underestimated me, and I underestimated myself. I thought silence was strength. I thought composure meant absorbing harm quietly. I was wrong. Strength is documentation, clarity, boundaries spoken calmly, and sometimes letting a recording play. If this story felt personal to you, tell me what boundary you had to set. Thank you for listening.